In this video, I'm going to show you how to sew a super easy halter top. For this project, we're going to need scissors, pins, thread, measuring tape, elastic, and a non-stretch fabric. We're going to start by draping out the front of the top, and for this part, I like to use a scrap fabric. Here, I'm just going to pin the elastic to decide how much gather I want for under the bust, and then I'm also going to fold the neckline to create that as well. I do want a side seam on the bust piece, and then the top is going to turn into a halter. So here we're just trimming and adjusting, and the main point is to make sure that we're leaving a 1 centimeter seam allowance along every edge. The shape of this piece is totally up to you. And this is where it's nice to use a scrap fabric because I'm just going to mark out the placement of the elastic and the seam allowance on this piece of fabric. And now we have a pattern piece, and here I'm just going to take in the bust a little bit because the mannequin's a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to smooth out the lines for my pattern, remembering to leave that 1 centimeter seam allowance along all of the edges. Now that's our front bust piece done, and we're going to end up cutting out 4 of these pieces. And now we're ready to drape the front and the back piece for our top. I'm going to drape this out of the actual fabric I'll be using for the top because I don't want to waste too much fabric, and this is an easy piece to drape. So I'm attaching it to the bust piece, cutting the side seam, and then roughly cutting the length that I want, keeping in mind seam allowance and how much seam allowance I want for the hem. And then I'm going to do the same for the front piece as well, connecting it a little lower so that the bust piece connects with the back piece for the side seam. It never hurts to leave a little extra on the sides and at the bottom to leave room for adjustments. We also want to make sure that we're not making it too tight, that we can still pull it over our head. Now we're ready to cut the bust piece out of our real fabric, and we're going to cut 4 of these pieces, 2 on the right side of the fabric and 2 on the wrong side of the fabric. And we want to make sure that we're cutting all 4 of these pieces on the bias to create some stretch for the bust. Then we're going to take these 4 pieces that we just cut out and place them right sides together. Then I'm placing pins at the neckline and the underarm, and I'm going to sew with a straight stitch along those 2 edges. To ensure that the seams lie flat, we're going to cut a few notches in the curves. This is always important to do when you're creating a facing piece with a curve. Then we're going to flip both of these pieces right side out and iron the seams. And here you can see the stretch from the bias cut. Now we're ready to attach these pieces to the front piece, and I'm going to do a slight change to the shape of the top by cutting out a scoop for the bust pieces. And then I'm going to pin all of these pieces together, right sides together. And then I can sew along where I pinned. Now I'm going to cut out 2 strips of fabric 50 centimeters by 4 centimeters. We're going to fold in 1 centimeter on each side and then fold that piece in half, and this is going to create our straps. The straps are going to help give a cinch around the waist to give the top a better fit. So after ironing both of those, we're going to sew them with a straight stitch. Next, we're moving on to the back piece of the top, which we're just going to hem the top of this piece with a regular hem. And we're going to pin that down and then sew it with a straight stitch. This is where it's important to always leave a little extra for seam allowance. Now we're ready to attach all of our pieces. So we're going to place our straps on the inside, place right sides together, and sew along the side seam, making sure that we're placing the straps equally on either side of the top. And then we can sew that with a straight stitch and trim away any of the extra fabric poking through the side seam. Now we're going to create a channel for our elastic, which we're going to cut out of our fabric and measure it against the elastic we'll be using. We just want to make sure it's wide enough that we have 1 centimeter on each side to fold in and iron down, and that it's still wide enough for our elastic. And then we want to pin this along the raw edges that are created by the bust and the front piece just to cover and lock those in. And then I'm going to do 2 stitches along the top and the bottom of that piece, right along the edge of the fabric. And then with that sewn, I can trim away any of the extra fabric from that strip. We're now ready to insert our piece of elastic into the channel that we just created. I like to do this with a safety pin. Then I'm going to pin the elastic down and then pull the elastic till it creates a gather that I'm happy with, and then I can pin it down on the other side. Before you lock this elastic in with your sewing machine, it'd be good to try the top on to make sure you like the way it fits. and then you can sew the elastic down. Next, we want to create the halter straps. So after measuring the width, we're going to double that measurement and add 2 centimeters for seam allowance. And as for the length, that's totally up to you whether you want them to be short straps or longer straps. Then we're going to fold that piece in half. I created a pointed edge for one of my ends. And then we're going to fold in the seam allowance just to tuck in the raw edges. And then place pins all along the edge. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned. Then we're going to tuck in the raw edges of our top and insert our strap, and then place it down with a pin. And then we're going to sew where we pinned. And we're going to do the same for both sides. I found a bow that I decided I liked that I'm going to hand sew in a later step. But first I'm going to start by hemming my top. You could easily do a basic normal hem, but I decided to do something with a little more detail. So I'm just going to measure the circumference of my top and cut out a piece in that length, adding 2 centimeters. The piece that I'm adding is also about 10 centimeters in width. I'm going to start by sewing the 2 ends of this piece right sides together. And here I've created a little tube that I'm going to attach to the bottom of my top. So attaching right sides together of this tube piece and my top, I'm going to pin it all along the edge, and then sew where I pinned with a straight stitch. And then we're going to iron the seam allowance from that stitch we just created down, and we're going to iron 1 centimeter from the bottom of the strip up. And then we're going to fold that piece in half, tucking in the seam allowance that we just ironed and pinning it along the seam. And then we're going to sew along where we pinned. This is adding a little length as well as a little weight to my top that really worked with my fabric. And you're all done! Thank you so much for watching, and if you liked this video, please subscribe.